Good morning and welcome to the Better Buildings webinar series. We're dedicated to bring you the latest and actionable insights from leading industry experts. This is an annual series as a chance to explore the topics, technologies, and trends that affect your organization, as well as efforts to accelerate energy efficiency adoption. Before we dive in, I want to share a couple of few housekeeping points. Please note that today's webinar will be recorded and archived on the Better Buildings Solution Center. We will follow up when today's recording and slides are made available. Next, attendees are in listen-only mode, meaning that your microphones are muted. If you experience any audio or visual issues throughout the webinar, please send a message to the chat located at the bottom of your Zoom panel. My name is Sarah Zaleski, and I'm your moderator today. I'm a senior advisor with the Building Technologies Office, where one of my focus areas is zero and low carbon buildings, and working with building designers and district planners on how to realize their low carbon goals. Before we hear from our panelists today, I want to share a couple of opportunities with you through the Better Buildings. First is the Better Climate Challenge. Through this program, DOE is challenging companies, states, municipalities, and other organizations to commit to reducing emissions from portfolio-wide operations by at least 50% within 10 years. DOE's Better Buildings will support their efforts with technical assistance and peer exchange to share solutions to reduce emissions and pursue renewable energy. To date, DOE has engaged leaders across 30 economy leading organizations. If you can go to the next slide, you'll see the logos of these organizations. Across manufacturing and the public sector and commercial buildings have already joined the Better Climate Challenge. If you're interested in learning more or joining us in this, please reach out to your Better Buildings contact or visit the Better Buildings Solution Center. Next slide, please. I also wanted to share with you a program called the Design and Construction Allies, which was launched last year. This is a program of leading architects, engineering, and contracting firms that are committed to helping enable routine design and delivery of zero energy and zero carbon ready buildings, and to identify and address barriers to delivering these buildings. Next slide. So we know that architects, engineers, and contractors are crucial and important to buildings because decisions made by these folks impact buildings' energy use, their carbon emissions, operating cost, and comfort. And I will note that it's both carbon emissions from operating emissions as well as embodied carbon that these stakeholders can have a really important impact on. So we see this community is playing a key role in helping building owners, many of which I know are on the phone today, achieve their energy and climate goals. So we'll be hearing from one of the members of this ally working group later in the call today. But I wanted to share this because two of the areas that this working group has chosen to focus on in the next couple of years is one, cultivating client demand. So really being able to share with their clients the strategies and financing strategies and ways to be able to make it pencil to build and retrofit ultra high performance buildings. And then the other working group is really focused on embodied carbon. So we'll be hearing a little bit more about that today. And obviously it's the focus of today's webinar. So we know that buildings can be both part of the problem, but as well as part of the solution, and really thinking about our kind of economy-wide carbon emissions and embodied carbon. So if you can go to the next slide. Today we'll be using an interactive platform for our Q&A, polling and feedback. So if you can please take a minute, maybe pull out your phone or go to another web browser window to go to slido.com. If you open that up in a new window or on your phone, today's event code is #DOE. And we're going to use this to ask our panelists questions. Feel free to submit questions at any time throughout the presentation. We'll be doing Q&A at the end of all three presenters. And you can also select a thumbs up icon on the platform if there's questions that somebody else has asked, and we'll see what some of the most popular questions are. So before we get going, we want to learn a little bit more about you who's on the phone today. So let's start off with a few polls, if you wouldn't mind going to Slido. So the first one is just what best describes your role. So we know that we hear oftentimes on the Better Buildings webinars from building owners, service providers, architects and contractors, utilities, government. So let's see who we have on the call today. Give it just a minute. Okay, coming in. Keep waiting for them to stop moving, but pretty dynamic. All right, so it looks like we have about a quarter of folks working for some form of government, maybe state, local, or federal. Another maybe quarter are consultants. We have a fair amount of researchers, also building contractors and designers. About 10% of you are building owners or operators. All right, great. Thank you for taking the time to do that. So we'll have two more quick polls. One, what is your level of familiarity with embodied carbon? So this is kind of from one, I've never really heard of it, two, general awareness of what embodied carbon is, three would be basic understanding of what it is and how to choose what low embodied carbon opportunities exist. And then after that, really a solid knowledge or really considered kind of an expert in embodied carbon and implementation. This is very helpful. Thank you all for taking the time to share this with us. Okay, so it looks like about half of you, are about in the middle, some basic understanding of the opportunities. And there's about a third of you all that have a general awareness of what embodied carbon is. And then we have, it looks like 2% of us on the call are experts in this space. So thank you for joining us as well. I know it's a rapidly evolving space. I know here at DOE, we're thinking more and more about this space, whereas traditionally we've been more focused on operational carbon. So it's a pretty exciting and evolving area. Okay, and then one last poll before I introduce our speakers. So what are you most interested in learning today? And feel free to choose more than one response here. So everything from, what embodied carbon is to why it's important, where to find resources to learn more, and how to make decisions on to lower embodied carbon in projects. Okay, thank you for this. So it looks like the clear winner is how to make decisions to lower embodied carbon. So I'm pleased to say that I know what our presenter is going to be presenting today. And I think, and I know that we're going to be able to discuss that in some depth. So that is great to hear. All right, without further ado, I am excited to present today's great lineup of presenters. So if we can go to the next slide. The first speaker we'll be hearing from is Victoria Herrero-Garcia, and she is a senior sustainability and carbon project manager for Ambient Energy, a Mead and Hunt company. She enjoys initiating embodied carbon conversations with design teams early in design and helps develop sustainability strategies to achieve carbon reductions. So Victoria is going to really be giving us kind of a bird's eye view. She's worked in this space for quite a long time of, what embodied carbon is, why it's important, some of the tools out there, how to kind of think through some of the methodologies. After Victoria, we'll be hearing from Ryan Poole, who leads sustainability for DPR Construction, which is a technical builder with offices spreading globally. DPR is innovating sustainable practices for how they operate, build, and ultimately help change the world. Through strategic partnerships, Ryan harnesses the power of collaboration and unity to provide influence towards creating a healthier future for all. So Ryan's going to really be giving us some additional tools and really to look at from the contractor perspective and what kind of value the contractor can bring to reducing carbon, embodied carbon in your projects and some of the tools that they've used at DPR. And then lastly, we'll be hearing from Duffy. Anna is a sustainability manager at Hudson Pacific Properties with years of experience in commercial real estate ESG programs. In her current role, she manages key sustainability initiatives such as driving progress towards Hudson Pacific Properties' science-based targets and net zero waste by 2025. She also furthers the company's decarbonization strategies, including efforts to reduce embodied carbon in both their developments and redevelopments. And we'll be hearing from Anna really from the building owner and developer perspective of some of the steps that they've taken at Hudson Pacific Properties to reduce their embodied carbon, and some resources available to building owners to do the same. So thank you again all for joining us today. And with that, I will hand it off to Victoria to kick us off. Thanks, Victoria.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you everyone for being here today to learn and discuss a little bit more about embodied carbon. Next slide. As Sarah mentioned, we are here in this panel today to talk about assessing and reducing embodied carbon. Next slide. I work on a firm that I can likely say that we are working toward a resilient and regenerative built world, and I'm happy to share with you today. Next slide. My firm has the core services of building performance engineering, sustainability consultant, and commissioning. And today I'm going to discuss two of my favorite topics and what I like to work the most on, whole building life cycle assessment and net zero carbon consulting and low carbon procurement. Next slide. So to start with the differentiation of what operational carbon and embodied carbon is, for those not familiar, operational carbon is the carbon that is emitted once the building is completed and occupied, and is related to the operations of the building. The embodied carbon is all the emissions related to the materials that are being used in the project, transportation, installation, replacement, and end of life. Next slide. As you can see here, that is what I just described. The embodied carbon includes all these stages, including extraction as well, and is also known as global warming potential, GWP. The unit of measurement is kilograms of CO2 equivalent, and the little e comes because it can include other greenhouse gases, not just CO2. Next slide. Why does embodied carbon matters? When we look at the big pictures of global emissions by sector, we can see that the yellow parts of the pie accounts for the 11% if we only talk about core and shell. And next slide. But when we include other building materials, we come to a conclusion that is about 21% of the total global emissions. Next slide. And it's very important to be aware of this, because we are projected to add 2.5 trillion square feet of buildings, new construction, within the next 39 years. That means to build an entire New York City every month, and approximates to 468 New York cities total. That is a lot of new construction. Next slide. Back to operating versus embodied carbon. To date, we have been discussing a lot of like energy reductions and operational carbon reductions. And when we do a building as usual, as you can see on the left side of the pie, of the graph, we have operational carbon being a big chunk of that pie and embodied carbon being a very small. And when we go towards a high performance building, expecting also the greening of the grid, the operational carbon becomes very small compared to embodied carbon. Next slide. And as you all are aware, climate change is the single greatest challenge of our time. So we need to know what we can do today. Next slide. From the last Glasgow COP26, there was a report generated by the Climate Action Tracker. Here shows it, there's a lot of information, but the key things that I want you to look at is like different scenarios using policies and action, 2030 targets, pledge and targets. So different scenarios and where the global warming or the amount of yeah, the global warming, sorry, will be. So if we go to the next slide, the most optimistic scenario is that if we do everything that it has been announced, all the targets and all the policies in place, and we generate long-term strategies, we can get to the 1.8 degrees Celsius, which is a little bit higher than 1.5, but that is where we're trying to get. Next slide. So where we are today, here in the United States, we are, you can see on this map, there is a state by clean legislation that has passed. And this is all in relationship to embodied carbon. There are other states and cities that they have policies, or they are trying to pass the state by clean. Next slide. If you go to the Carbon Leadership Forum's website and you look for the policy, city policy toolkit, there is a map, interactive map where you can learn more about what is being done and read about the policy. Next slide. And in addition to what it is done at the state, at city level, there is also rating systems that reward towards embodied carbon reductions. The first one will be building and material reuse. You are also rewarded by low embodied carbon material procurement, and if you do whole building life cycle assessment. Next slide. So with all that, where we start, so we cannot reduce what we cannot measure. Next slide. So there's two measurement approaches that I want to discuss with you today. One is the procurement of low carbon materials, and the other one is the whole building life cycle assessment. Next slide. So for the procurement of low carbon materials, we really need to understand what is the impact of the global warming potential of each material or product. And for that, next slide, we need to know we need to understand an environmental product declaration, which is a report or document that is kind of like the nutritional label that gives us information about the impacts that this product will have in the environment. Next slide. The point of discussion today is to discuss embodied carbon and the global warming potential of that product. So that will be, next slide. That will be understanding the environmental product declaration system boundary. So there is a few terminology that I want you to know today. Cradle to gate is mostly the system boundary, most commonly used system boundary for an EPD. Next slide. Cradle to gate includes product stage only, so A1 through A3. Next slide. And that means life cycle stages. So the product stage, next slide, only includes the raw material supply, the transport to manufacturing, and the manufacturing. And that's why it's modules A1 through A3 only. Next slide. This is an example of an environmental product declaration, and those are the key things that I want you to look always for. You need to know the product, the declared product or functional unit, and the product category rule or PCR, and also the EPD scope to know if it's a cradle to gate or cradle to grave. This one, for example, is a cradle to grave, which makes it a little bit harder for comparability. And the global warming potential is shown there as well. Next slide. So how do we compare EPDs? So we have the nutritional level with all this information, but we need to make sure that the declared unit is the same, the PCR is the same, and the system's boundary is the same in order to compare them. Next slide. So there are available tools out there. They're free to any user, and one of them is the EC3 tool, and the other one is the one-click LCA Planetary. They both use system boundary A1 through A3, and they have the same functional unit and the same PCR. Next. The next one is whole building life cycle assessment. Next slide. This is a design comparison between a baseline and a proposed case. And the scope can vary depending on the rating system. It can be only building enclosure and a structure, or you can also include interior materials. Next slide. The whole building LCA system boundary is cradle to grave. Next slide. And that means that includes A1 through C4 life cycle stages. Next slide. These are the life cycle stages in general for any product. Next slide. Now module A, the product stage, includes also transport to the site and construction installation. Next. The use stage, modules B1 through B7. Next slide. End of life stage, module C1 through C4. Next slide. So that will be the whole building life cycle stages in total is a cradle to grave and system boundary A1 through C4. Next. Here are the whole building LCA tools available right now. This is to complete a whole building LCA with different scopes. Athena calculator, one-click LCA, Tally, and E2. The first three are the primary use in North America. Next slide. So I kind of have a call to action for you all to maximize embodied carbon reductions. First, reuse and reduce as much as you can. Secondly, early conversations are key. We have seen and maximize embodied carbon reductions, having discussions with design teams in concept design, and up to 40% reductions. Set up targets. What is your scope and what do you want to, how much you want to reduce? Low carbon procurement, because it's very important, because at the end of the day, it's very small there, but the blue biggest square is A1 through A3 life cycle stages. So most of the impacts come from the product stage. And then include all disciplines, include the client, design team, and builder estimators are very important in early conversations. Next slide. Thank you very much. And I'm going to pass it to Ryan.
Yeah, thanks so much, Victoria. Hey, everyone. Glad to be here today and talk to you a little bit about the contractor's perspective on embodied carbon. Next. So a little bit more about assessing and reducing embodied carbon from the contractor's perspective. So Victoria did an incredible job of talking really more about the material procurement side, which contractors have a huge handle in, but also want to dive a little deeper into the actual operations on a construction site, because that's a big piece of our embodied carbon that we don't want to forget. Next. So what we're going to use today to discuss this is a framework that was built within Building Green organization from the Sustainable Construction Leaders Group called the Contractor's Commitment. So excited to bring this here to you today. An incredible group work to put this together, and it's got several different categories. So carbon reduction, job site wellness, waste management, water management, and materials. Today we're going to focus on all the ones that reflect on embodied carbon, so we won't go into job site wellness. We'll also show a little bit about how that tier system works. So here you can see an example on the next one where we get into carbon reduction. So you can see it's got a good scaling for you to provide some prioritization. So good, better, and best. So some benchmarking for us to have across the industry and some format to help prioritize. And then we broke it down into plan and implementation, tracking and reducing, offsetting as a last resort, right? And then disclosing that information. So we want to make sure we prioritize reduction over offsetting always. Planning here, you can see things such as Victoria mentioned earlier around EC3 for material selection, as well as utilizing certain types of equipment, right? So driving towards electrification and types of equipment that we use, and even get into scope 1, 2, and 3 for our individual organizations. So not just looking at what we're doing on the construction sites, but what we're doing at a corporate level too, how we're actually operating as businesses, as contractors, and things that we can continue to do to improve there. Next. So what I'm going to do is, after showing some of those, I'm going to go through some specific examples that we're doing at DPR to help champion some of these things. So one of the things that we want to make sure that's really permanent to everybody is that the most sustainable building is one that already exists. So adaptive reuse can have a huge benefit on lowering embodied carbon because you already have a lot of the materials there. As an operational emissions drop with adoption of renewable energy, embodied emissions, those which are attributed to building materials and energy for construction, will likely dominate new building emissions by 2050. Next. And here I'll show a little bit of a graphic. So as Victoria mentioned on the left-hand side, we've got the 11% of embodied carbon that comes from building materials and construction, and she even showed an even greater percentage than that. On the left, what we've got is showing you the progression, right, of adaptive reuse from building nothing at 100% reduction of our embodied carbon, all the way down to just building efficiently, right? And so you can see the massive difference in impact from where you use adaptive reuse to new raw materials. Next. So, at DPR, we believe it's our responsibility as contractors to help show our clients the way too. And so we've taken it upon ourselves to have 6 of our own offices as net zero energy. So these are all in different climate zones, and we're continuing to add more to the portfolio. So San Diego here was our first one all the way back in 2010, before we had rating system certifications for net zero energy. We had, Phoenix, which was the largest of its kind when it was certified. And then all the way over to DPR Sacramento here, which is our most recent one, which was mass timber. So we'll do a little deeper dive into the embodied carbon study we did on that specific office. Next. So waste management, waste is something that gets kind of pushed to the side when we're talking about embodied carbon, but a massive part of it, right? It can definitely not only, clutter the environment that we live and work in, but causes a lot of emission issues on the back end as well. And so we want to make sure that we're addressing that head on and trying to drive zero waste culture on our job sites. So here you can see where we've talked to try to provide contractors guidance on, implementing the right plans, selecting the right partners, putting the right cultural pieces in place, and then reporting and disclosing that information as an industry together so we can continue to have constant improvement. Next. So here are some examples of how we've been striving to drive zero waste culture on construction sites. First and foremost is always having a waste management plan. It's important to communicate that all the way from having the right partners on the front end, your design partners, your consultants, your owner, and the vendor that you're going to use for your waste collection. Those are all key important factors to make sure that you have early collaboration on and set the right expectations. And so then make sure it's important that that is educated and communicated through all of the folks that are coming on the job site and helping build it. So having the right presentation for orientations as craft come in, the right signage, the right setup, it's got to be multilingual. It's going to be the best impact to make sure that you have all of the things that you need for the right recipe for creating a zero waste culture. So here you can see some examples of, signage that we have, logistics plan, and then also addressing the problem. It's important not to just tell people what we're doing, but why we're doing it and why it matters. Next. Lean construction practices. So this is not just within construction. This is really can be a way of life and with any role that you currently serve in. And so really lean is all about designing waste out of a process. And so we're excited to have a lean leadership course at DPR that is a lengthy course that talks to you all about how to design waste out of your processes that you do it every day. So the proper planning techniques, the proper things to be conscious of, and tools that you need to continue to eliminate waste out of our everyday processes. Next. Prefabrication. Prefabrication is a key for us to continue to lower waste in the overall industry. And so you can see here that some of our prefabrication processes lower our waste from 74 to even 87%. Not only is it lowering waste, but it's all because of the precision that you have. It's also, improving quality, allowing us to have a lower carbon footprint because some of these facilities can operate with renewable energy. And so it can drastically cut down on the overall carbon footprint from the materials that we're selecting. So, here I've got an example of our company in Phoenix called Digital Building Components that does fully pre-assembled wall assemblies with the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing in them, and exterior wall and whatnot. So you can stand up an entire, 15,000 square foot space within a matter of a couple of days with minimal people. And then on the left, is a prefabricated restroom. So these can be plugged and played into, all kinds of different scenarios. But you got to think like a lot of the work that you have within a space goes into restrooms and kitchens, right? Because they take so many different like intricacies within the elements that they have. And so prefabrication can definitely have a huge impact on not speed to market, but really driving down that embodied carbon. Next. So water, water always gets tossed aside when we're talking about embodied carbon as well, but it's an incredibly important factor, not necessarily from an emissions perspective directly, right, but from transporting of the water, right? So the more we continue to be conscious of conservation and reduction of our water sources, allows us to not only save water, and which has its own problems, right, but also save the energy that it takes to transport that water. And so we're excited that we're addressing that here. Next. So one of the innovative solutions I'm really excited to share with you guys today that we've done on one of our job sites is a concrete truck washout reclamation center. So, you have several different activities that use massive amounts of water on a construction site. And the more we can find solutions to use rainwater capture to eliminate the usage of potable water that has to be transported to the site for these uses, can make a massive impact on our environmental assessment for our sites. So this particular center was able to save 13,500 gallons of recycled water in just one day, which will add up to over 2 million throughout the life of the project. No potable water was used. We used rainwater capture and treatment for these, and massive amounts of energy saved from not having to transport that water to the site, which then in turn reduces our embodied carbon. Next. So material selection. So this is what, Victoria covered so well, and so won't go too deep here, but definitely important for us to address it as contractors, right? Because we're on the procurement side of it. So it's incredibly important that we have that early engagement with the design team to select the right tools and materials that provide us with a healthy impact on the planet and the environment, and the people that live in it. So we're really looking at a full circle from a health and wellness perspective, but really also that those EPDs and how we can continue to drive transparency in the market. Next. So you can look at here, this is an example showing the total carbon impact. And what I really wanted to illustrate here is how much of that the structure can be, right? So you see substructure and superstructure there, and that takes up over 50% of the actual embodied carbon within a space. And so I want to make sure we put some special attention on the structural components and some of the things that we're doing to be innovative there. Next. So yeah, Victoria gave a great illustration earlier. This is another example of that shows some of the main structural components that we use in buildings. So steel, concrete, and wood. I've got a wood highlighted a little bit more there, right? Because it's one of the few, the only building material we have that's got carbon sequestration benefits to it. So renewable resource that actually sequesters carbon throughout its life cycle. And so shows the process there of what it takes, right, to extract that raw material, process it, transport it, and get it to the job site where we're putting it in place. Next slide. Yeah, so mass timber on our Sacramento office, super excited to share, the benefits that we were able to receive there. We did a really deep analysis not only from the embodied carbon aspect, but also from the health and wellness. So multiple benefits. But this particular project, the amount of embodied carbon we saved from utilizing this beautiful mass timber saved the equivalent of 33 cars off the road each year, or the energy to power 14 homes every year. Next slide. Incredibly important to leverage data management because we have such vast amounts of information that we're discussing and communicating here as we work through project teams together. And so Victoria, already hit on a bunch of these incredible solutions here, Tally, EC3, Athena, and Carbon Smart palette. And then we also use some other in-house tools here that help us track, waste management, the carbon within our materials, and how, and actually here on the below one, we have an online database that allows us to, access to go and shop for products that have that transparency. They provide the EPD and HPDs that we need. And we know that they're made responsibly and that it's with a company that's pushing, healthier products. Next slide. So at DPR, we've created our own in-house practices and really have tried to revamp those and marry them up to this incredible commitment that we have with the contractor's commitment at Building Green. And so, impactful piece that tells all of our people in-house, why sustainability matters to us and the planet, how it impacts us and the planet, and, consistency and benchmarking and prioritizing to show all of our folks the right way to champion these efforts. Next slide. And here we provided a deeper insight, right, into how you actually go and accomplish some of these things. So we've got all kinds of incredible links that provide our craft and leaders in the field with direction. Next slide. So how can you participate? So if you're one of those, 12% of contractors we had on the call today, please join, go check out the Contractor's Commitment, download it. Join, sign up. We've also got the Sustainable Construction Leaders Group, and we love to have the more the merrier. The more we can spread this and get more contractors on board, the larger impact we're going to make. You can also send some feedback to us at Candace at Building Green there. Next slide. And if you're not a contractor, so all the owners and everyone else that's out there, how can you help advance this? Ask your contractors if they've heard of it. Ask them to follow the measures. Ask contractors to consider signing on, including this in your RFPs. And then if you're a designer, including it in your Division 1 specs. Next. And the last but not least, before I hand it off to Anna, talking about early collaboration being key, right? Having, folks like Victoria, myself, and Anna all in the room together at the same time early in the project to make those decisions is how we're going to actually make the right impact for an economical solution for our clients. And so together, we can build a healthier environment for both people and the planet. And with that, I'm excited to hand it over to Anna and talk a little bit more about the owner's perspective.
Thanks so much, Ryan. And Anna, before you get started, just a quick reminder that we have some great questions coming in through Slido, and I encourage you to add yours. Remember, the code is hashtag DOE, so we can be all teed up at the conclusion of Anna's slides. And some of those great resources that Ryan mentioned will be available in the resource sheet that's provided after the webinar as well. So with that, Anna, take it away. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Duffy, a Sustainability Manager with Hudson Pacific Properties, and excited to be here with you all today, talking a little bit about how, as an owner, we're addressing and reducing embodied carbon across our portfolio. Next slide. So first, a little bit about Hudson Pacific. We are an owner-operator of existing buildings up and down the West Coast. So we operate in LA, all the way from Vancouver down to LA. Operator of Class A office space and some studios as well. So we have 35 sound stages in Hollywood, and we are also a developer of new properties. So we have a new studio coming online in London, some new studios in LA, and I'll be talking a little bit about how we're reducing embodied carbon in those developments today. And then just on the right side here, you'll see we serve primarily tech tenants. Next slide, please. Cool. So a little bit about where we are today. Hudson Pacific's Better Blueprint ESG platform was developed in kind of recent years, actually. And we've been fortunate enough to actually already achieve net zero in our operational carbon. So Victoria and Ryan spoke a little bit about addressing those scope 1 and 2 emissions. We chose to address those first. We achieved net zero carbon across our scope 1 and 2 emissions through a 4-part strategy that includes energy efficiency, on-site renewables, off-site renewables, and renewable energy certificates, so RECs, and carbon offsets. And we realized that that was really only one small piece of the puzzle of our carbon footprint. We had this whole embodied carbon supply chain really tied up in the materials that we purchase for our development. So we completed a scope 3 inventory using the GHG protocol's scope 3 evaluator and validated the idea that the emissions and embodied carbon tied up in those building products for our developments is a huge portion of our carbon footprint. We found that over 80% of our total company emissions are tied in our capital goods supply chain. So that's things like concrete and steel and other materials that we are purchasing to build these new studios and new buildings. So we knew that operational net zero wasn't enough. We needed to start addressing the embodied carbon in our developments. Next slide, please. So a little bit about our commitment to embodied carbon. In 2020, we published a sustainable design vision that outlines our ESG expectations and aspirations. So requirements and then kind of like the aspirational goals we try to reach if it's possible. And this policy includes some minimum requirements like deploying adaptive reuse whenever possible. Ryan spoke to the most sustainable building is the one that already exists. So we've included that in our policy. And then achieving LEED Gold certification or higher on all projects and measuring each project's embodied carbon footprint. And since publishing our initial sustainable design vision, we built a really solid understanding of what the embodied carbon in our development pipeline looks like. And once we kind of had that better understanding of what that footprint looks like, we were able to commit to creating project-specific embodied carbon reduction targets for each development or major repositioning. So what that kind of looks like is creating a baseline, doing a whole building LCA based on the existing design, and then determining how we can reduce embodied carbon as much as possible through that design, whether it's optimizing design or procuring lower embodied carbon materials, and then developing an ambitious target to actually reduce embodied carbon as much as possible. And so you can go to the next slide. So we kind of started out with creating or having a decentralized approach to figuring out what our embodied carbon looks like. We used a variety of different tools like the climate positive design tool, EC3, Tally, some of these things Ryan and Victoria have already mentioned. And on the right side of the slide here, you'll see some of our findings. So we've completed some of these studies and we have a variety in process. And for those ones that we have in process right now, we've really gained that better understanding of what the tools that work for us are, what our baselines look like, and what those targets should look like. So now we've created a more streamlined approach to addressing embodied carbon in our developments. We're going to work with one third party who's going to be kind of integrated into our development team and our ESG team. And we're going to use one tool so that we can really create a streamlined approach, a streamlined and centralized approach, and be able to address and optimize reductions across all our projects. Next slide, please. And so I'll speak to a few case studies that we've completed thus far. So one project is an adaptive reuse project in LA. At One West Side, we redeveloped the former West Side Pavilion Mall into a state-of-the-art tech campus that's already pre-leased to Google. We, rather than tearing down the entire structure and building from the ground up, we were able to reuse much of the structural steel of the original mall. And we found that we that resulted in a 33% reduction of embodied carbon from a ground up scenario. So we kind of completed this embodied carbon study retroactively to find what were the actual savings that or the avoided emissions that we were able to achieve from this adaptive reuse project, and found that structural steel was a really big piece of that puzzle. Next slide, please. And then while we have many development and repositioning projects going on at any given time, we also are constantly turning over the interiors of our buildings and building new spaces for our tenants, improving our common areas. And we've learned that there are many material alternatives that can reduce embodied carbon in these kinds of smaller scale projects. And we can do it with minimal cost, low to no cost impact. So one example of Hudson trying to walk the walk is doing an embodied carbon case study in our Vancouver regional office. So we were building out a whole new regional office there, and we had a team that was really focused on reducing embodied carbon. They were passionate about it, and they wanted to see how we could procure low embodied carbon materials. So we focused on high impact materials and worked with a third-party consultant to do this. And we found that some of those high impact materials include wall systems, ceiling tile, carpet tile, gypsum wallboard. And so once we kind of focused on those materials, we saw, okay, what do we have spec'd? How can we procure lower embodied carbon materials? And we were able to reduce our embodied carbon 23% in that project from active procurement decisions, and a really engaged team that kind of drove the process with our consultants and architects and contractors along the way. And from that study and build out, our team wanted to publish those findings in a low embodied carbon tenant fit out guide. And so we're proud to share this with everyone on the call today, and more widely. It'll be included in the resources, and it speaks to kind of the process that we went through, some of our case studies, and how teams can reduce embodied carbon in their fit outs as well. And another really engaged team is our Northern California construction team. Like I said, they're constantly building out new common areas and vacated spaces, and wanted to figure out how we can reduce embodied carbon in the spec suites that we're building for new tenants. So we took the following steps. I worked really closely with our construction managers to collect EPDs for our existing building standards. We worked with architects and product manufacturers like Interface, Armstrong, to collect EPDs for existing building standards. And then we requested, okay, provide us with some alternatives that are similar design, similar cost, but lower embodied carbon. And we really wanted to focus on that piece of not compromising design or cost, to make the case for lower embodied carbon. And then we were able to get our leasing team sign off and install. And so some of the results of that are that we now have 60,000 square feet of carbon neutral carpet installed across our NorCal portfolio. And as compared to the original building standards, this carpet has 86% less embodied carbon. And we've also been able to reduce embodied carbon in our ceiling tile products as well. And then finally, again, to kind of the adaptive reuse point, they've also started taking a really active approach at reusing materials wherever possible and engaging with our vendors on take back recycling programs. So we've found that we're able to recycle much carpet, a lot of carpet that we're taking out and replacing, that can turn into new carpet. Next slide, please. So beyond our efforts within Hudson Pacific at our redevelopments and interior fit outs, we really wanted to engage with the industry to share our learnings. And we're excited to join Building Transparency's OwnersCAN group as a founding partner. And OwnersCAN is really focused on promoting awareness of embodied carbon, increasing use of the EC3 tool, and creating resources for the industry to more widely adopt embodied carbon studies and address embodied carbon in their own products. And so one of our first kind of work products that we put out recently, and you can go to the next slide, is the OwnersCAN Embodied Carbon Action Plan. So it is currently in draft form, and we are constantly iterating and improving on it, adding resources to build it out. And it really takes owners through the first steps through all the way through to deconstruction, the whole life cycle of a building on how to address embodied carbon. Next slide, please. And you can find this online. I've provided the link to the Building Better Buildings team. And one of the really cool things about this project or this action plan is that it includes action items for each key stakeholder in the process. So we have the construction manager, Ryan, can go in there and figure out what steps does he need to be involved in to address embodied carbon in a project. We have the sustainability consultant, so Victoria can go in there and see where she has to step in. It's a really great resource to learning how to kind of engage all those key stakeholders in the process to address embodied carbon. Next slide, please. And then it also addresses the different stages of embodied carbon. So at what stages of the development project are you focusing on different life cycle emissions? Next slide, please. And then this is kind of just a view of what it looks like fully built out. So there's an interactive web page online where you can take a look at this, and then you can also download a PDF and kind of just pick out the slides that are most relevant to you. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to share some key takeaways as we wrap up. I think one of the most important things everyone on this call can do is get educated, figure out what kind of stake you have in addressing embodied carbon at your company, and use the OwnersCAN Embodied Carbon Action Plan or other resources like those Ryan mentioned or Victoria mentioned to understand your role and how you can reduce embodied carbon. Number two, get buy-in. I think we've all spoken to the fact that there are so many stakeholders involved in addressing and reducing embodied carbon. And so it's really important to get that buy-in early on, get everyone on board and understanding of what embodied carbon is and what are the steps to actually reduce it. And then upon realizing new development projects or interior fit outs, consider how you might be able to reuse structures and optimize design to reduce the amount of materials you even need to procure in the first place. Then understand your baseline and what those high impact materials are. And when you're going through procurement or thinking about procurement, identify what lower embodied carbon options are. And lastly, request EPDs. You can do this easily in interior fit outs. The architects and product manufacturers are we found very happy to help, and ask them for lower embodied carbon alternates. Demonstrate that your buying power is really important. That's what we've found to be important with Hudson Pacific. And yeah, we're excited to answer some questions now. So I'll turn it back over to Sarah to run Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anna. And if the panelists can join me back, just tackle some of these questions. Excellent presentations. Thank you all so much. So we have a number of great questions coming in through Slido. So we will try to get through as many as we can. I'll orient some of you guys or direct some of you guys to answer if you can kind of keep your responses fairly quick. So we'll see how many we can get through in this rapid fire. So one of the questions that I think has gotten a lot of attention is sample procurement documents. So Anna, you just addressed some of this, but so an owner says, yes, we want to do lower embodied carbon on our next project. Where can we go for some sample documents around how to integrate that into procurement? Somebody want to kick us off on that?
Well, I can share that through the OwnersCAN Embodied Carbon Action Plan. We're actually developing resources. So how can you include embodied carbon in your RFPs for contractors like Ryan, so they understand what requirements, what do I have to be focusing on for embodied carbon? We're developing specs that are focused on low embodied carbon procurement options. And so as we continue to build out that resource, there will be resources that owners can use and kind of just drop in, ideally, just drop into their contract templates.
That's great. Thank you so much, Anna.
And Sarah, I just want to add to that. Right now, you have in the meantime, until Anna and her team develop these specifications, you can always go to the EC3 tool. They do have baselines, so they do have the different sets, like average, conservative, and you can play around with materials types, material global warming potential to see which one will be better fitted to your project. And also the Carbon Leadership Forum, if you look for the Owners Toolkit, they also have the resources with the Carbon Leadership Forum baseline for materials. And all the, I didn't mention that I also have resources, and Ryan, everybody has resources that will be provided with.
Yes, afterwards. Thank you so much. So Ryan, a quick question for you. So a number of folks have asked about, how do you motivate contractors to reduce and reuse materials when sometimes it's so much easier to just buy new materials and start from scratch?
Yeah, so we've got a long way to go really on creating some more life cycle building centers, right? So there are some in some cities, and there's some new platforms that are coming out, and contractors like us are trying to take other means and methods to reutilize materials, right? And so, but it takes a collective group together. The reality is contractors are put up against a schedule and a budget, right? And you have to beat that. And so sometimes going and sourcing, right, reusable materials can be a tedious process. And that's why I think Anna and Victoria and I are going back to the key, and we're all saying it, right? Early collaboration is incredibly important, because if you're an owner like Anna that has, aggressive sustainability goals, which is incredible, you've got to have the right partners on board, and you've got to have them on board early so that you can do the proper research. The reality is, and this is going back to the first question, is that as an industry, we still have a long way to go in driving transparency in the products that we have, and what's available for reuse. And so the more we can come together collectively to leverage that, the better we'll be able to implement those things in the future. And like I said, the first priority should always be to look for spaces for adaptive reuse. That isn't always available, right? It's not that you always have a case where you can utilize adaptive reuse, but it should be a priority. And then if you're not, if you have demolition or something on a job site, it's always great to approach this as deconstruction and not demolition, right? Disassembling the components of the building so that they can be salvaged and reutilized.
And hopefully there'll be more of a market for those,
yes,
for those products too. So it looks like we just have time for maybe one more question, maybe two. I will say that I know there was a number of questions asked in Slido for particular speakers as well. So we are going to try to address those afterwards and include those in the transcript of the call. So if you didn't get your question answered, we will do our best to answer it post-call or post-webinar. So I guess maybe one more question. There's a number of questions around budget and financial impacts. So one, I think part of that question is, does this impact, or how have you seen reducing embodied carbon impact project budgets? And do you have examples of budgets either being, improved or saving costs through some of this stuff, and or coming out cost neutral? So I don't know who wants to kick us off with that.
I can jump in on that one, and then Ryan, maybe you can take over. So we found through some of our earlier studies, like our Bentall Center regional office and our repositioning project there, that we really haven't found much cost impact. But again, we've focused on making sure that the lower embodied carbon alternatives that we're identifying are not more expensive, because we don't want to compromise cost, and we don't want to compromise the construction schedule to address embodied carbon. But to that point, at those ones that I mentioned, and some other procurement decisions we've made through steel and concrete at a development project in Seattle, we've found that it's really just more about the effort and the exercise of identifying those materials. And oftentimes it's not that they're more expensive, it's just creating that spec that you want a lower embodied carbon material, identifying it and procuring it. And we haven't found that it's impacted schedule or cost really.
Yeah, and that's due to, like, us taking the right approach with early collaboration and having the right partners on board. But there's still, it's an open question, right? Because absolutely adaptive reuse can be less expensive than building new, and so that's one scenario. Even within the realms of, concrete as an example, right? There are concrete solutions that have low embodied carbon that are now, a little bit more expensive, but there are some that are not, right? So there's the adoption of like carbon cure. Most of the time when we're utilizing carbon cure, it's not in cost increased at all, right? But there are other things like Blue Planet or utilizing recycled glass pozzolan as a replacement for cement. And those can be a little more expensive, but the reality of why they are is because of economy of scale. We just haven't pushed those solutions enough. We don't have enough people requesting them. And so really they're just not economically viable yet, but we're getting there. You know, we're continuing to push as an industry, and some of those items and solutions that are more expensive are continuing to come down in price. PV is a good example. You know, we've had leaps and bounds in the availability and cost of that over the last 2 decades.
Great, thank you so much. Well, we have just less than a minute left, so I'm going to go to the closing slides. But I first just want to give a very hearty thank you to all 3 of our presenters. That hour flew by. I took a lot of notes. I learned a lot from all of you, so thank you so much. Feel free to contact our presenters directly with additional questions. I encourage you also to follow the Better Buildings Initiative and to join us December 16th for our next webinar titled Roadmap to Carbon Reductions in Multifamily Housing. So if you're interested in learning more about the topics discussed today, I encourage you to download our additional resource handout from the Zoom chat box right now. And that will have many of the links to the great resources that Victoria and Ryan and Anna shared with us today. Like I said, a lot of evolving work in this space. It's very exciting. I know we'll be hearing much more about this in the coming months and years. So thank you again to all of our panelists and to all of our participants for joining us today. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.